I never thought salt would be the catalyst for someone's downfall, but here we are, and I'm still processing the absolute insanity of what happened in my quiet Colorado subdivision. My name is Lucas Garrison, and I've lived in the Meadowbrook Heights community in Aurora, Colorado for 3 years. It's one of those middle-class neighborhoods where the houses all look vaguely similar. Everyone has a 2-car garage, and the homeowners association makes sure your grass is exactly the right shade of green. I'm a software engineer who works from home, which means I have the distinct pleasure of witnessing all the neighborhood drama unfold in real time. The winter of 2024 hit Colorado hard. We're talking about back-to-back snowstorms that dumped anywhere from 6 to 12 inches every few days throughout January and February. I'm originally from Minnesota, so winter doesn't faze me. I know how to handle snow, ice, and the misery that comes with freezing temperatures. Part of that knowledge includes the liberal application of ice melt on driveways, walkways, and anywhere someone might slip and break their neck. That's where Patricia Hensworth comes into the picture. Patricia, or Patty as absolutely nobody was allowed to call her, was the vice president of our HOA. She was 52 years old, drove a white Lexus SUV, and had that particular haircut that every meme on the internet associates with asking to speak to the manager. You know the one, short in the back, longer in the front, with blonde highlights that were just a shade too artificial. She wore athleisure everywhere despite never actually exercising, and her voice had this sharp quality that could cut through concrete. I first ran afoul of Patricia in early February, right after a particularly nasty storm dropped 8 inches of heavy, wet snow overnight. I woke up at 6 in the morning, looked out my window, and immediately knew I had work to do. By 7, I was outside with my snow blower, clearing my driveway and the sidewalk in front of my house. The HOA rules stated that sidewalks had to be cleared within 24 hours of snowfall, but I preferred to get it done early. Plus, the mail carrier usually came around 10, and I didn't want her struggling through snow drifts. After clearing the snow, I grabbed my 50-pound bag of ice melt from the garage. It was the good stuff, calcium chloride mixed with magnesium chloride, effective down to -25 degrees Fahrenheit. I scattered it generously across my driveway, the apron where the driveway met the street, my front walkway, and the public sidewalk in front of my property. The crystals were blue-tinted, so you could see exactly where they'd been applied. Within minutes, I could hear the satisfying crackle of ice beginning to melt. I was just finishing up, brushing off my gloves, when I heard the sound of footsteps crunching through snow. I turned to see Patricia marching toward me, her face already set in an expression of disapproval. She was wearing pristine white snow boots that clearly had never seen actual snow before this winter, black leggings, and a North Face jacket that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. "Lucas," she said, my name sounding like an accusation. "We need to talk about your salt usage." I blinked at her, still holding the empty bag. "My salt usage?" "Yes. You're using an excessive amount of ice melt and it's causing problems for the neighborhood." She gestured at my driveway as if I'd committed some heinous crime. "That blue salt you're spreading is getting tracked everywhere. It's damaging the concrete, and it's terrible for the environment. Dogs walk on these sidewalks, Lucas. Children play in this snow." I took a deep breath, reminding myself that losing my temper with the HOA vice president was probably not the best move. "Patricia, I'm using ice melt to prevent people from slipping and falling. It's a safety issue. And I'm only applying it to my own property and the public sidewalk I'm responsible for maintaining." "You're using too much," she insisted, her voice rising. I've been monitoring the situation, and you use at least twice as much as any other resident. It's wasteful, it's ostentatious, and frankly, it shows a lack of consideration for the community. Ostentatious salt usage, I repeated slowly. That's a new one. Her eyes narrowed. Don't take that tone with me. I'm here in my official capacity as HOA vice president. We've had complaints. From who? That's confidential. So you've had complaints, but you can't tell me who complained about me making sure people don't slip and fall on ice. I could feel my patience wearing thin. Patricia, with all due respect, I'm preventing liability issues. If someone falls on the sidewalk in front of my house because I didn't put down enough ice melt, guess who gets sued? The HOA has specific guidelines about salt usage, she said, pulling out her phone. She scrolled for a moment, then read aloud. Section 12, subsection C states that homeowners must maintain their walkways in a safe condition during winter months while being mindful of environmental impact and community aesthetics. Exactly. Safe condition. That's what I'm doing. The key phrase is while being mindful of environmental impact. Your excessive salt usage is not mindful, Lucas. I'm issuing you a warning. If you continue to use this much ice melt, you'll be fined. I stared at her. You're threatening to fine me for making my property safe. I'm enforcing HOA regulations. Reduce your salt usage to reasonable levels or face the consequences. She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving me standing in my driveway, dumbfounded. I went inside, made myself a strong cup of coffee, and tried to calm down. My wife Sarah had been listening from the doorway. Sarah Lancaster and I had been married for 5 years, and she'd heard plenty of my HOA complaints before, but this one took the cake. She cannot be serious, Sarah said, shaking her head. Her dark hair was still messy from sleep, and she wrapped her hands around her own coffee mug. She's going to fine you for using ice melt. Apparently my salt usage is ostentatious, I said, still trying to process the conversation. I'm not sure how one uses salt in an ostentatious manner, but I've apparently mastered it. Sarah laughed, but there was frustration in it. This is ridiculous, even for Patricia. What does she expect you to do, just let ice build up? I guess so. Or use some pathetically small amount that won't actually do anything. I pulled out my laptop and opened the HOA bylaws document. I'd learned early in my residency here that knowing the exact wording of the rules was essential when dealing with Patricia and her ilk. I found Section 12, subsection C, and read it carefully. The language was vague, probably intentionally so. It mentioned being mindful of environmental impact, but provided no specific measurements or limits on ice melt usage. In other words, it was the kind of rule that could be interpreted however the HOA board wanted to interpret it on any given day. This is unenforceable, I said, showing Sarah the screen. Look, there's no definition of what constitutes excessive usage. It's completely subjective. You know, Patricia doesn't care about that, Sarah pointed out. She worked as a paralegal at a law firm downtown, so she understood legal language better than I did. She'll fine you anyway, and then you'll have to appeal to the full HOA board, and that's just a headache. She was right. The HOA board consisted of Patricia, the president named Donald Kemper, who was basically Patricia's puppet, and 3 other members who usually went along with whatever Patricia wanted because it was easier than arguing with her. I'd been to exactly 1 HOA meeting, and it had been such a tedious experience that I'd never gone back. Over the next week, we got 2 more significant snowfalls. Each time, I cleared my driveway and sidewalk, and each time, I applied ice melt. I did reduce the amount slightly, though not because Patricia told me to. I just wanted to be able to say I'd made an effort if it came to a fight. but I still used enough to actually melt the ice and create safe walking conditions. Patricia noticed. Of course she noticed. She seemed to spend half her time monitoring the neighborhood for violations. On February 15th, I found an official HOA violation notice in my mailbox. It was printed on fancy letterhead and everything. Notice of violation, it read. Property address, 847 Meadowbrook Lane. Violation. Excessive ice melt usage in violation of HOA Bylaws Section 12, C. Fine, $150. You have 10 days to appeal this decision to the HOA board. Continued violations will result in additional fines and potential legal action. It was signed by Patricia Hensworth, Vice President, and Donald Kemper, President. I was furious. $150 for keeping my sidewalk safe. I immediately drafted an appeal letter, citing the vague language of the bylaw, the safety necessity of adequate ice melt, and the potential liability issues of not properly maintaining walkways. I requested a hearing before the full board and submitted my appeal the next day. The hearing was scheduled for March 1st, which was 2 weeks away. In the meantime, winter continued to dump snow on Colorado, and here's where the story gets interesting. Patricia lived 4 houses down from me on the same side of the street. Her house was slightly larger than mine, with a circular driveway and professional landscaping that must have cost a fortune. I'd noticed over the course of the winter that Patricia's approach to snow removal was, shall we say, minimal. She had a service that plowed her driveway, but they usually didn't come until a day or two after each snowfall. Her front walkway, which led from the driveway to her front door, was often covered in compressed snow that had been walked on but not properly cleared, and she used almost no ice melt. I'd seen her sprinkle a tiny amount near her front door occasionally, but her driveway and walkway were generally just cleared of loose snow and left to nature. Which meant that, with the temperature fluctuations we were having, a classic Colorado pattern of cold nights and slightly warmer days, her driveway and walkway were developing a nice coating of ice underneath the snow. I noticed this because I walked my dog, Baxter, a golden retriever, past her house every evening. Baxter liked his routine, and his routine included a long walk around the neighborhood regardless of weather. During these walks, I could see quite clearly that Patricia's property was way more hazardous than mine. The irony was not lost on me. Sarah suggested I document this. If she's going to fine you for using too much salt, maybe you should point out that she's using too little, she said. Turnabout is fair play. I wasn't sure I wanted to sink to that level, but I did start taking photos during my evening walks, just in case. The day of my HOA hearing arrived. It was held in the community clubhouse, a small building near the neighborhood entrance that was used for meetings, events, and the occasional birthday party. I arrived at 7 p.m. sharp, carrying a folder with my appeal letter, photos of my properly maintained property, printouts of the vague bylaw language, and research I'd done on recommended ice melt application rates. The board sat at a long table at the front of the room. Patricia was there, of course, wearing a business casual outfit and an expression of smug satisfaction. Donald Kemper sat next to her, a balding man in his 60s who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The other 3 board members were Margaret Wu, a retired teacher, Robert Finch, who owned a local plumbing business, and Deanna Torres, a stay-at-home mom with 3 kids. There were a few other residents in attendance, probably there for their own issues or just for the entertainment value. I recognized my next-door neighbor, Tom, who gave me an encouraging nod. Donald called the meeting to order, and they went through some standard business first. Approval of last meeting's minutes, treasurer's report, discussion of landscaping bids for the common areas. Finally, they got to my appeal. Next item, appeal of violation notice for property at 847 Meadowbrook Lane, Lucas Garrison, Donald read in a monotone voice. Lucas, you have 15 minutes to present your case. I stood and walked to the front of the room. I'd prepared a whole speech, but looking at Patricia's face, I decided to keep it simple and direct. Thank you. I'm appealing the $150 fine I received for allegedly excessive ice melt usage. First, the bylaw cited in my violation is too vague to be enforceable. It requires being mindful of environmental impact, but provides no specific measurement or standard for what constitutes excessive use. Second, I'm using ice melt at rates consistent with manufacturer recommendations for effective ice melting in Colorado winter conditions. Third, and most importantly, adequate ice melt is a safety necessity. Slip and fall accidents are a serious liability concern, and undertreating ice and snow on walkways puts both residents and visitors at risk. I passed out copies of the research I'd printed. According to the Snow and Ice Management Association, the recommended application rate for calcium chloride ice melt is approximately 2 to 8 ounces per square yard, depending on conditions. I've been using approximately 4 ounces per square yard, which is in the middle of the recommended range. This is not excessive. This is appropriate. Margaret Wu was looking at my handouts with interest. Robert Finch was nodding slightly. Deanna Torres seemed to be paying attention. Those were good signs. Patricia, however, was glaring at me. "You're cherry-picking data," she interrupted. "That doesn't account for environmental damage." "Actually, it does," I said calmly. The SEMA guidelines specifically address environmental concerns and recommend this application rate as a balance between effectiveness and environmental impact. I'm also using a calcium-magnesium blend, which is less harmful to pets and plants than pure sodium chloride. "You're still using too much," Patricia insisted. "I've personally observed your property, and the amount of blue salt crystals visible is clearly excessive compared to other residents. The crystals are blue so you can see where the product has been applied," I explained. "That's a safety feature, and just because I use more than some other residents doesn't make my usage excessive. It means I'm taking safety seriously." "This is ridiculous," Patricia said, her voice rising. "You're being deliberately difficult." The HOA has a right to regulate salt usage for the good of the community. The HOA has a right to enforce reasonable regulations, I shot back. A fine based on a vague, subjective standard is not reasonable. Donald cleared his throat. "Let's keep this civil." "Does anyone on the board have questions for Mr. Garrison?" Robert Finch raised his hand. "Have you had any complaints from neighbors about your salt usage? Any actual damage to property or concerns raised directly to you?" "No," I said. The first I heard about any issue was when Patricia confronted me on February 8th. I've had no other complaints from any neighbors. "And you've reduced your usage since then?" Deanna Torres asked. "Slightly, yes, but I'm still maintaining my property at a safe level." Margaret Wu spoke up. "Patricia, you said there were complaints. Can you elaborate on who complained and what their specific concerns were?" Patricia shifted uncomfortably. "As I told Mr. Garrison, that's confidential, but multiple residents have expressed concern about excessive salt in the neighborhood." "I'd like to know specifics if we're going to uphold a fine," Margaret pressed. "If there's actual damage or documented problems, that's one thing. But if this is just a subjective feeling that he's using too much, I'm not sure that's grounds for a fine." "I have photographic evidence of excessive salt application," Patricia said, pulling out her own phone. She showed photos she'd apparently taken of my driveway and walkway, the blue crystals clearly visible against the concrete and snow. Those photos show appropriate coverage for effective ice melting, I countered. They don't show excessive usage, and I have photos of my own. I pulled out my phone and showed the pictures I'd taken of Patricia's property. This is 843 Meadowbrook Lane, taken on February 23rd, 2 days after the last snowfall. As you can see, the walkway is covered in compressed snow and ice, with minimal treatment. This is actually a safety hazard and arguably a violation of the same bylaw, which requires maintaining walkways in a safe condition. The room went silent. Patricia's face turned red. "You've been spying on my property," she demanded. "I've been documenting neighborhood conditions while walking my dog," I said evenly. "Just like you've apparently been documenting mine." Donald looked uncomfortable. "Let's not turn this into a back and forth. The board will discuss and vote on the appeal. Lucas, thank you for your presentation." "You can sit down." I returned to my seat. The board huddled together, speaking in low voices. I could see Patricia arguing animatedly while the others looked less convinced. After about 10 minutes, Donald called for a vote. All in favor of upholding the violation and fine. Patricia and Donald raised their hands. All in favor of overturning the violation and fine. Margaret, Robert, and Deanna raised their hands. The motion to overturn passes 3-2. The violation is dismissed and the fine is voided. I felt relief wash over me. Patricia looked like she'd bitten into a lemon. "This is a mistake," she said loudly. "We're setting a precedent that residents can use as much salt as they want with no regard for environmental impact or community standards. We're setting a precedent that vague bylaws can't be used to fine residents arbitrarily," Margaret said firmly. "If the board wants to regulate salt usage, we need to draft clear, specific guidelines with measurable standards, not subjective judgments." The meeting moved on to other business, but Patricia was clearly furious. She kept shooting me glares across the room. When the meeting finally adjourned at 9:30, she intercepted me on my way out. "You think you're very clever, don't you?" she said, her voice low and angry. "Undermining HOA authority, turning the board against me." "I just defended myself against an unfair fine," I said. "Nothing personal, Patricia." "Everything is personal in an HOA," she hissed. "You've made an enemy tonight, Lucas. I'll be watching your property very carefully. One blade of grass too long, one trash can left out too late, one single violation, and I'll make sure it sticks." She walked away before I could respond. Tom, my neighbor, caught up with me in the parking lot. "That was amazing," he said with a grin. "I've never seen anyone stand up to Patricia like that. She's been on a power trip for years." "I just hope I haven't made things worse," I admitted. "Nah, you're fine. And honestly, good for you. Someone needs to keep the HOA in check." I drove home and told Sarah about the meeting. She was thrilled that I'd won the appeal but concerned about Patricia's threat. "She's going to make your life miserable," Sarah predicted. "You know how vindictive she can be." "Let her try," I said, though I wasn't feeling as confident as I sounded. "I'll follow every rule to the letter." "She won't find anything to fine me for." Famous last words. Over the next week, Patricia did exactly what she'd promised. I caught her walking past my house multiple times, phone out, clearly looking for violations. She took pictures of my trash cans on trash day. She took pictures of my mailbox. She took pictures of my front door wreath. I started to feel like I was under surveillance, which was deeply uncomfortable, but I was meticulous. I made sure my grass was exactly the right length even though it was barely growing in March. I brought my trash cans in within an hour of the garbage truck passing. I checked and rechecked the HOA bylaws to make sure every aspect of my property was in perfect compliance. Meanwhile, winter wasn't done with Colorado yet. On March 10th, we got hit with a surprise late-season storm. It was one of those heavy, wet snowfalls that are typical of early spring in Colorado. 12 inches fell overnight, turning everything white again. The temperature dropped to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that the snow packed down hard and the moisture turned to ice. I was out early the next morning with my snow blower and ice melt. I'd been vindicated by the HOA board, so I went back to using the amount I knew was necessary for proper ice melting. My driveway, walkway, and sidewalk were clear and safe by 8 a.m. Patricia's property was another story. Her plow service came around noon and cleared her driveway, but they did a sloppy job, leaving thick patches of compressed snow. Her walkway wasn't touched at all. By the afternoon, with the temperature hovering just around freezing, that compressed snow was turning into a slick sheet of ice. I happened to be looking out my front window around 3 p.m. when I saw Patricia arrive home in her white Lexus. She pulled into her driveway, parked, and got out of her car. She was carrying shopping bags from what looked like a trip to the mall and was talking on her phone, not paying attention to where she was walking. What happened next seemed to occur in slow motion. Patricia stepped out of her car and started walking toward her front door. She was wearing those same pristine white boots and gesturing with one hand while she talked on the phone. She made it about 3 steps before her foot hit a patch of ice hidden under a thin layer of snow on her walkway. Her feet went out from under her. The shopping bags went flying. The phone launched from her hand, and Patricia went down hard, landing directly on her right hip with an impact I could almost feel from 4 houses away. The scream that followed was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It was a shriek of pain and shock that echoed through the quiet neighborhood. I was out my front door within seconds, running toward her house. By the time I got there, Patricia was lying on her walkway, clutching her hip, her face contorted in agony. "Don't move," I said, kneeling next to her. "Patricia, don't try to get up. I'm calling 911. My hip," she gasped. "Oh God, my hip. It hurts so much." I dialed emergency services while trying to keep Patricia calm. "Yes, I need an ambulance at 843 Meadowbrook Lane in Aurora. A woman in her 50s fell on ice and is complaining of severe hip pain. She's conscious and alert." Other neighbors were coming out now. Tom arrived with a blanket and we carefully covered Patricia without trying to move her. Margaret Wu came over with her medical background and assessed the situation. "She probably broke her hip," Margaret said quietly to me. "Very common injury from this kind of fall. She needs to stay still until the paramedics get here." The ambulance arrived within 10 minutes. The paramedics carefully examined Patricia, stabilized her, and loaded her onto a stretcher. Her face was gray with pain, and she'd stopped talking, just whimpering softly. They administered pain medication and took her away, sirens blaring. I stood in Patricia's driveway with a small group of neighbors, all of us looking at the walkway where she'd fallen. The ice was clearly visible now, a slick, treacherous surface that had been inadequately treated. The irony was so heavy I could barely breathe. "She was complaining about your salt usage, wasn't she?" Tom said quietly. "Yeah," I said. "Fined me for using too much, said I was being excessive." Tom shook his head. "And now she broke her hip on her own ice because she didn't use enough. That's what we call poetic justice." "It's not funny," I said, though part of me recognized the absurdity. "She's seriously hurt." "No, it's not funny," Margaret agreed, "but it is a lesson." She was so focused on controlling your property that she neglected her own. Pride before the fall, literally. Over the next few days, news filtered back through the neighborhood grapevine. Patricia had indeed broken her hip, a severe fracture that required surgery. She'd had a metal plate and screws inserted and was facing months of recovery and physical therapy. She wouldn't be walking normally for quite some time, possibly not until summer. The HOA held an emergency meeting to appoint an interim vice president in Patricia's absence. They chose Margaret Wu, who was calm, rational, and didn't have a vindictive bone in her body. It was like a collective sigh of relief went through the neighborhood. But the story didn't end there. Because in our litigious society, when someone gets hurt, someone usually gets sued. I got the letter in mid-April. Patricia Hensworth was suing the HOA, claiming that the association had failed to enforce proper winter maintenance standards, and that this failure had directly contributed to her injury. Specifically, she was claiming that the HOA's vague bylaws about winter maintenance had created a situation where residents didn't know what standards to follow, and this had led to inadequate ice treatment on her property. Wait, her property. The property she owned and was responsible for maintaining. I called Sarah at work. You're not going to believe this. Patricia is suing the HOA because she fell on her own ice. Sarah was quiet for a moment, then started laughing. She's suing herself. She was the vice president. Technically, she's suing the HOA as an entity. But yeah, essentially she's blaming the organization she helped run for her own failure to maintain her property. And get this, part of her argument is that the vague bylaws confused residents about maintenance standards. The same vague bylaws she used to try to fine you. Exactly. This is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard, Sarah said. What happens now? I don't know. I assume the HOA's insurance will handle it. But the HOA's insurance company had other ideas. They launched an investigation into the incident, and as part of that investigation, they interviewed residents about winter maintenance practices in the neighborhood. I was interviewed by phone by a claims adjuster named Kevin Richards. Mr. Garrison, I understand you had a dispute with Miss Hensworth about ice melt usage earlier this winter, Kevin said. Yes. She fined me for using what she considered excessive amounts of ice melt. I appealed and the fine was overturned. Can you describe your winter maintenance routine? I explained my snow removal and ice melt application process in detail. Kevin asked about my application rates, the products I used, and the condition of my property throughout the winter. And did you observe the condition of Miss Hensworth's property? Kevin asked. I walked past her house daily with my dog. I noticed that her walkways were often not adequately treated for ice. Did you ever mention this to her or to the HOA? I brought it up during my appeal hearing as an example of inconsistent enforcement, but otherwise no. I'm not the HOA enforcement person. That was her job. Kevin thanked me for my time and said he'd be in touch if he needed anything else. A week later, I got a call from Margaret Wu. Lucas, the insurance company denied Patricia's claim. They determined that she was responsible for maintaining her own property and that her injury was the result of her own negligence, not any failure by the HOA. That's reasonable, I said. She's furious. She's threatening to sue the HOA personally, not just the insurance claim. She wants $200,000 for medical expenses, pain and suffering, and lost wages. Can she do that? Legally, she can sue anyone for anything. Whether she'll win is another question. The HOA board is meeting tomorrow night to discuss getting a lawyer. I wanted to give you a heads up because you'll probably be called as a witness if this goes to court. Sure enough, the situation escalated. Patricia hired a personal injury lawyer, some aggressive guy with billboards all over the Denver metro area promising maximum compensation. The HOA hired a defense attorney, and the whole thing turned into a legal mess. I was deposed in June. Patricia's lawyer, a slick character named Richard Marks, tried to paint me as some kind of salt vigilante who had used excessive amounts of ice melt to deliberately make Patricia look bad, which had created psychological stress that distracted her and contributed to her fall. It was the most absurd argument I'd ever heard, and the HOA's lawyer, a sharp woman named Jennifer Alvarez, tore it apart. "So your theory," Jennifer said to Richard during the deposition, "is that my client, Mr. Garrison, used appropriate amounts of ice melt as determined by industry standards and confirmed by the HOA board, and this somehow caused your client to fall on her own inadequately maintained property. The excessive salt usage created a hostile environment," Richard insisted. "A hostile environment of excessive safety," Jennifer raised her eyebrows. "Mr. Garrison's property was safe. Your client's was not. Your client, who was the HOA vice president responsible for enforcing maintenance standards, failed to maintain her own property to those same standards. That's negligence, not a hostile environment." The deposition went on for 3 hours, but it was clear that Patricia's case was weak. The facts were simple. She had fallen on her own property, which she had failed to properly maintain, while trying to enforce rules on others for over-maintaining their properties. The irony was legally relevant. The case dragged on through the summer. I gave my testimony, provided my documentation and photos, and tried to stay out of the drama. Patricia remained out of sight, recovering from her surgery. Rumor had it she was bitter, angry, and determined to make the HOA pay. In August, there was a development that changed everything. During discovery, Patricia's lawyer had to turn over her phone records and emails as part of the lawsuit. The HOA's lawyer found something interesting: a series of text messages between Patricia and Donald Kemper, the HOA president, from February. In these messages, Patricia and Donald had discussed the salt usage issue. But more importantly, they discussed creating violations for residents Patricia didn't like, including me. The text showed that there had been no actual complaints from other residents about my salt usage. Patricia had made that up. She'd targeted me specifically because I'd questioned her authority at a previous meeting about an unrelated issue. In other words, the violation had been retaliatory and fraudulent. Jennifer Alvarez brought this to the attention of the HOA board, minus Donald, who was immediately asked to resign. The board then filed a counterclaim against Patricia for fraud, abuse of authority, and damage to the HOA's reputation. This was getting serious. What had started as a personal injury lawsuit was now a legal battle involving fraud allegations. The HOA board voted to refer the matter to local authorities to investigate whether Patricia's actions constituted criminal misconduct. The Aurora Police Department got involved in September. A detective named Sarah Morales contacted me for an interview. We met at a coffee shop in town, and I walked her through the entire timeline: Patricia's initial confrontation, the violation notice, my appeal, the text messages that had come to light, and finally, Patricia's fall and subsequent lawsuit. "So she created a fraudulent violation to retaliate against you for questioning her?" Detective Morales asked, taking notes. "According to the text messages that came out in discovery, yes. And then she fell on her own ice and tried to sue the HOA, which brought all of this to light, correct?" Detective Morales shook her head. "People never cease to amaze me. The cover-up is always worse than the crime." The investigation expanded. Police discovered that Patricia had issued at least 6 other fraudulent violations over the past 2 years, targeting residents who had challenged her or whom she simply didn't like. She'd collected thousands of dollars in fines based on made-up complaints or selectively enforced rules. The HOA's books showed the fines had been collected, but there was no documentation of the supposed complaints that had triggered them. This was now criminal fraud and potential embezzlement. The district attorney's office got involved. In October, Patricia Hensworth was arrested and charged with multiple counts of fraud, theft, and abuse of authority. The arrest happened at her home, and of course, everyone in the neighborhood found out immediately. It was the biggest drama Meadowbrook Heights had ever seen. Patricia's lawyer tried to argue that HOA violations were civil matters and couldn't be prosecuted criminally, but the DA's office disagreed. The fraudulent collection of fines constituted theft by deception under Colorado law. The abuse of her position as HOA vice president was an aggravating factor. The trial was scheduled for January 2026. In the meantime, Patricia's lawsuit against the HOA was dismissed with prejudice. The judge ruled that she couldn't claim negligence on the part of the HOA when she herself had been a board member responsible for enforcement, and when the evidence showed she'd been selectively enforcing rules for personal vendettas. December arrived, and with it, more snow. I continued my winter maintenance routine, using appropriate amounts of ice melt and keeping my property safe. The new HOA board, with Margaret as president, had drafted clear, specific guidelines for winter maintenance that included recommended application rates for ice melt, timeline requirements for snow removal, and language about balancing safety and environmental concerns. The new rules were reasonable, enforceable, and most importantly, applied equally to everyone. Patricia's criminal trial began on January 14, 2026. I was called as a witness for the prosecution. I testified about my experience with the fraudulent violation, provided the documentation I'd kept, and answered questions about Patricia's behavior and statements. The prosecution also called other residents who'd been targeted by Patricia. There was an elderly man who'd been fined for having a lawn ornament Patricia deemed inappropriate, even though the bylaws didn't prohibit it. There was a young couple who'd been fined for parking their car on the street overnight during a party, even though overnight street parking was allowed. There was a woman who'd been fined for having the wrong color flowers in her front garden, a rule that didn't exist in the bylaws. The pattern was clear. Patricia had used her position to bully residents and collect money through fraudulent fines. Donald Kemper was also called to testify. He admitted to going along with Patricia's schemes, though he claimed he hadn't realized they were illegal. He'd accepted a plea deal in exchange for his testimony and was facing probation and community service. The defense tried to argue that Patricia had been acting in good faith to enforce HOA rules, but the text messages undermined that argument completely. The messages showed clear intent to target specific residents and create violations where none existed. The trial lasted a week. On January 21st, the jury returned a verdict, guilty on all counts. Patricia's sentencing was scheduled for February. She faced up to 2 years in prison and was required to pay restitution to all the residents she'd defrauded. The judge would also consider her ongoing medical issues from the hip injury when determining the sentence. I attended the sentencing hearing out of morbid curiosity. Patricia appeared in court using a cane, still recovering from her injury nearly a year later. She looked diminished, nothing like the aggressive woman who'd confronted me about salt usage that cold February morning. The judge was a no-nonsense woman named Elizabeth Cordova. She listened to the victim impact statements, including one from me about the stress and expense of dealing with Patricia's fraudulent violation. She reviewed Patricia's medical records and the probation department's pre-sentencing report. Then she delivered her sentence. Miss Henceforth, you held a position of trust in your community. Homeowners associations exist to maintain property values and create harmonious living environments. Instead, you used your position to harass residents, collect fraudulent fines, and enrich the HOA's coffers through dishonest means. While I acknowledge your medical condition, I cannot ignore the serious nature of your crimes. You are sentenced to 18 months in prison, followed by 2 years of probation. You are ordered to pay full restitution to the victims of your fraud, totaling $8,400. You are permanently banned from serving in any HOA leadership position. Do you understand this sentence? Patricia nodded, tears running down her face. Yes, Your Honor. Furthermore, I'm ordering that you complete 200 hours of community service after your release, to be performed in a capacity that serves the public good. Perhaps you'll learn something about actual service rather than self-service. Patricia was taken into custody that day. Due to her medical condition, she'd be housed in a facility that could accommodate her physical limitations, but she was going to prison nonetheless. I left the courthouse feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction that justice had been served, but sadness that it had come to this. If Patricia had just been reasonable, if she just followed the rules fairly and treated residents with respect, none of this would have happened. Her own vindictiveness and need for control had destroyed her life. The HOA moved forward under new leadership. Margaret Wu was a fair and reasonable president, and the new board focused on actual community improvement rather than petty enforcement. The neighborhood felt lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted. Sarah and I still lived at 847 Meadowbrook Lane. Winter came and went, and I continued to use appropriate amounts of ice melt to keep my property safe. No one complained. No one monitored my salt usage. No one threatened me with fines. Tom would sometimes joke about it when we talked over the fence. "Hey, Lucas, using any ostentatious amounts of salt lately?" he'd say with a grin. "Only the most ostentatious," I'd reply. "I'm a salt rebel, didn't you know?" The incident became neighborhood legend. New residents would hear the story and shake their heads in disbelief. The woman who fined someone for using too much ice melt, then broke her hip on her own ice and ended up in prison. You couldn't make it up. I thought about Patricia sometimes, wondering if she'd learned anything from the experience, wondering if she understood that her downfall had been entirely self-inflicted. She'd been so focused on controlling others that she'd lost control of herself. So determined to find fault in everyone else that she'd ignored her own failures. So convinced of her own righteousness that she'd crossed legal and ethical lines without hesitation, and all of it had started with salt. Simple, mundane, household ice melt. The kind of thing you buy at the hardware store without a second thought. But in Patricia's hands, it had become a weapon, a means of asserting dominance and control, and that weapon had ultimately turned on her in the most literal way possible. The following winter was quieter. I maintained my property, helped my elderly neighbors with their snow removal when needed, and lived my life without HOA drama. The new board sent out reasonable reminders about winter maintenance and offered to help coordinate salt purchases for residents who wanted to buy in bulk for a discount. It was what an HOA should be, helpful, not hostile. I kept the violation notice Patricia had sent me. It was framed now, hanging in my home office as a reminder. A reminder that petty tyranny never ends well. A reminder that fairness and reasonableness matter. A reminder that karma has a sense of irony. Baxter and I still took our evening walks around the neighborhood. We'd pass Patricia's old house, which had been sold to a nice young family with 2 kids. They kept the walkway immaculately clear in winter, with generous applications of ice melt. I'd sometimes smile at the irony. One evening in late February, almost exactly 2 years after Patricia's initial confrontation with me, I was walking Baxter past her old house when I ran into Margaret. She was out checking her mailbox and waved me over. "Did you hear?" she asked. "Patricia was released early for good behavior. She's out of prison." "Really? Where is she now?" "Moved to Wyoming, I heard. Cheyenne, living with her sister. Apparently she wants nothing to do with HOAs ever again." "I can't blame her for that," I said. "Neither can I." Margaret paused. "You know, in a weird way, maybe this was the best thing that could have happened to her. She needed a wake-up call. She needed to face consequences for her behavior. Maybe now she can be a better person." "Maybe," I agreed, though I had my doubts. "And it was definitely the best thing for the neighborhood," Margaret continued. "We've had almost 0 violations in the past year. Not because people are breaking rules, but because the rules are reasonable and fairly enforced. Imagine that." We chatted for a few more minutes, then I continued my walk. The night was cold and clear, stars visible in the Colorado sky. Snow crunched under my boots and Baxter pulled at his leash, eager to investigate every smell and sound. Life had returned to normal, or as normal as life gets in an HOA-governed neighborhood. There would always be rules, always be some level of oversight, but with reasonable people in charge, it didn't have to be a nightmare. I thought about all the ways the situation could have gone differently. If Patricia had approached me with concerns instead of accusations, we could have had a civil conversation. If she'd enforced rules fairly instead of targeting people she didn't like, she'd still be vice president. If she'd maintained her own property as diligently as she'd monitored others, she never would have fallen and broken her hip. If she hadn't sued the HOA out of pride and anger, the fraudulent violations might never have come to light. If she'd just been a decent person, none of the terrible consequences would have followed. But she hadn't been decent. She'd been petty, vindictive, and ultimately criminal. And the universe, or karma, or whatever you want to call it, had responded in kind. She'd complained about my salt usage, then broke her hip slipping on her own ice. The poetic justice was almost too perfect. As Baxter and I rounded the corner back toward our house, I saw my own driveway and walkway, clear and safe, with a light dusting of blue ice melt crystals visible under the streetlight. Appropriate amounts, carefully applied, keeping everyone safe. Exactly as it should be. Sarah was waiting when I got home, dinner ready, the house warm and welcoming. She asked about my walk and I told her about my conversation with Margaret. "Patricia's out of prison. Do you think she'll ever come back to Aurora?" Sarah asked, concern in her voice. "I doubt it. And if she does, she's not allowed anywhere near an HOA. That was part of her sentence." I hung up Baxter's leash and washed my hands. Besides, I think she learned her lesson. Sometimes you have to fall before you can stand up straight. "That's unexpectedly philosophical of you," Sarah said with a smile. "I'm a man of depth and wisdom," I joked. "Also, I've had 2 years to think about this whole situation." Over dinner, we talked about other things. Work, plans for summer vacation, whether we should remodel the kitchen. Normal life, normal concerns. The HOA drama had faded into memory, just another story to tell at parties or when new neighbors moved in and asked about the neighborhood. But I never forgot the lesson. Power, even the small power of an HOA board position, can corrupt. Pettiness can escalate into criminality. And sometimes, the consequences of your actions come back to hit you exactly where it hurts most. For Patricia, that was literally true. Her crusade against my salt usage had ended with her on the ice, broken and defeated by her own negligence. The universe has a sense of humor, I decided. A dark sense of humor, maybe, but a sense of humor nonetheless. Spring arrived, and with it the end of winter maintenance concerns. I put away my snow blower and ice melt, not to be needed again for months. The neighborhood bloomed with flowers, lawns turned green, and life moved on. The HOA sent out reminders about lawn maintenance and summer guidelines, all reasonable and fairly applied. I never had another violation notice, never had another confrontation about my property maintenance. The new HOA board was everything the old one should have been: helpful, fair, and focused on actual community improvement rather than petty control. Tom and I would sometimes drink beer on his back deck and talk about the whole crazy situation. He'd been one of the residents Patricia had targeted, fined for having his trash cans visible from the street 15 minutes too long on trash day. He'd gotten his $200 fine refunded as part of the restitution order. "Best $200 I ever got," he said, raising his beer. And all it took was Patricia going to prison. "Here's to karma," I said, clinking my bottle against his. "May it always be served ice cold." "Ice cold with appropriate amounts of salt," Tom added with a laugh. The years passed. Sarah and I celebrated our 7th anniversary. We talked about starting a family, maybe having kids who could play in the safe, well-maintained neighborhood we lived in. Baxter got older, his muzzle turning gray, but he still loved his evening walks. The story of Patricia Hensworth became neighborhood folklore, the kind of tale passed down from old residents to new ones. "Did you hear about the HOA vice president who went to prison?" they'd say, and then the whole story would come out, getting slightly embellished with each retelling but remaining essentially true. It served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of petty tyranny and the importance of treating people fairly. I sometimes wondered what Patricia was doing in Wyoming, whether she'd found peace or was still bitter about how everything had unfolded, whether she'd ever acknowledged her role in her own downfall or still blamed others for her problems. I hoped she'd learned and grown, but I'd never know for sure. What I did know was that I'd learned something too. I'd learned to stand up for myself when treated unfairly. I'd learned that documentation and evidence matter. I'd learned that bullies often create their own destruction. And I'd learned that sometimes the universe delivers justice in the most ironic way possible. The bag of ice melt in my garage stood as a silent testament to all of it. Blue crystals of calcium chloride and magnesium chloride, mundane and ordinary, yet somehow at the center of an extraordinary sequence of events. Salt had been the beginning of Patricia's downfall, literally and figuratively. Her complaint about my usage, her own failure to use enough, her broken hip on her own ice, and the chain of events that had followed, all connected by something as simple as winter safety. I made sure to use appropriate amounts every winter after that. Not out,